All right, so I was looking at Genesis 13, and I was like, that's not a whole lot of verses. I'm like, this is either going to go really quick, or we're going to get talking, and no one's going to ever know it wasn't a whole lot of verses. And so, no one ever does that. So, I did want to start a little bit earlier today in hopes that we could enjoy our conversation. Normally it's at least 5 minutes after now when we get started, so we made some progress.
There is more coffee. I made more coffee.
Yes, more coffee. That helps too. So we'll go as normal. We can kind of read through around the room. So we'll start over here.
And Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the south.
Now, I don't know that I've ever paid any attention to that at all, but in my mind, he never went further south than Egypt. But according to this, he went south from Egypt. So that's really interesting. So he must have spent some time, obviously Egypt's in Africa, but even going a little further south into Africa. I don't know how long he stayed there. I don't think it was overly long because, he makes his way back, but just some interesting things to note. He happened to go down south in towards Africa.
Did he?
It says he went south.
Well, could it have been back to the south of Canaan?
I did think about that. The only thing I noticed is verse 3, it says his journey's from the south to Bethel. So I don't have any way to know one way or the other. But
Bethel's on the north side of Canaan.
It is, but all I know is that's a place that he had come from before. I don't see anything that would necessarily tell me he went north back to Canaan to then just call it the south. It could be. I thought about that too. But it's potential that he went down further into Africa.
If Pharaoh, I'm throwing this out as devil's advocate more
Yeah.
than anything, because you want to talk, let's talk.
Yeah, let's talk.
If Pharaoh threw him out of Egypt, he would have been probably in the northern end, because that's where the ruling areas were of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And if you went south, there was probably 1,000 miles of Egypt below that northern portion. So he was definitely taking the scenic route to get out of Egypt if he went that way at all.
Well, if that's the case.
Yeah, and it would have been river traffic,
Right.
not traffic along the land. So how did he feed all of his cattle and sheep on a boat? Not being Noah.
That's a good question.
I have no answers, just questions.
Yeah, I feel that. I don't know where he went. I don't know how far south he may have gone. I don't know if he probably would have stayed near the river because most civilizations in that time frame would live near fresh water. So near water is probably the best chance he has of, staying fed and having his animals fed. That said, I don't know. Just says he went south, and then maybe that's a translational thing where I would know more if I went to the Hebrew on it. I can tell you very honestly, I didn't. So, he went south, is what it says. Maybe that's Africa, maybe it's south of Canaan.
In Chicago, when you go south, you're going to the south side of Chicago.
Well, maybe he went to the south side of Egypt, I don't know. And then, they still were like, hey, you still need to get out of here, so head back up. But, verse 2.
And Abram was very rich in cattle and silver and in gold.
Yep, and some of that just came from Pharaoh. So, I'll tell you guys, I misremembered last week. For some reason, I thought the story with Abimelech happened right after. It apparently does not. There's some gap in between. But, nonetheless, he doesn't learn his lesson yet. But I think this still does fit well with the idea that God used the increase of Abram and Lot to separate them, which we'll see shortly. Verse 3.
And he went on his journeys from the south even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning,
We talked last week. Hai is potentially Ai that you'd see in the book of Joshua. It's listed to be at about the same place as you would have seen the place of Hai. And again, this is somewhere that he had already been. He'd already built an altar there. He'd already called upon the name of the Lord there. And so he's returning to places that he knows.
He did all that to get right back where he started.
That's right.
How many times have we done that? I know.
Yep.
Should've stayed there.
All right. So at this point, obviously, we see he went from the south even to Bethel. Abram travels back to Bethel where he was promised this land. I think it was technically in Shechem, or Sychem is how it was called then, where God said, this is the land you're going to have. But he went immediately from there to Bethel, between Bethel and Ai, and built an altar. So, verse 4.
Unto the place of the altar which he had made there at the first, and there Abram called on the name of the Lord.
Yeah, so Abram called on the name of the Lord in Genesis 12:8. And after God had told Abram that this was the land that he would be given. That was in 12:7. So just kind of as a bonus, you know, Abram is the example for the Israelite people. He's the patriarch, obviously. He's the one they look to, and they say, you know, what did Abram do? When the New Testament tries to convince the Jews of something, it uses Abram many times as an example. Like, as we'll get to when we get to Genesis 15, Abram believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. And that's used again and again throughout the New Testament. And the point is, he becomes the example. And, you know, the other thing we see is he calls upon the name of the Lord. It's almost like we might be told to do that at some point, somewhere in the New Testament. Like Romans 10:13. For whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Now, you have to understand that portion also comes out of Joel. It's not a quote from Abram. It's a quote from Joel. I think it's 2:32. Thank you. So, not that I'm saying that he's quoting Abram, but they continued to follow what Abram had done. And something I noticed as I'm doing an Old Testament study through this time is a lot of the things that happen in Genesis and shortly after repeat themselves quite a bit. You see a group that acts a lot like Sodom and Gomorrah in the book of Judges. They do things almost to a T the same way. So there's some really interesting things and some really interesting ways where the stories kind of seem to repeat themselves. As I heard somebody say before class started, there's nothing new under the sun. And isn't that the truth? So, verse 5.
And Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents.
Yep. So, Lot's still there. It's interesting, Lot also is very, very rich. Now, I think this has to do with him being near Abram, who God is blessing. There's something to be said about being in the proximity of someone who is being blessed by God. There's such a thing as common grace. The Bible talks about, you know, that God will bring the rain on the just and the unjust, and in many ways we're all blessed. But what you find is sometimes if you're around people who God is working with and really, doing things through, you can sometimes receive blessings by proxy. And I think that may played somewhat into Lot's benefit in this scenario.
Well, if he hadn't had all that, the cattle and stuff, they wouldn't separate.
Right.
So it was part of God's plan.
It was.
To do that.
Yeah.
Isn't it true also, I think it's Peter that speaks of Lot as a righteous man, says that this righteous man, his spirit was distressed by all the wickedness of the world that he saw around him. I think
Yeah.
sometimes Lot kind of gets that, we think Lot is evil, he's the bad guy, and I don't think he is. I think he's just not Abram.
Right.
He's not the first one called, and he makes some horrendous mistakes, some bad choices.
Right.
But the Bible still refers to him as a righteous man.
He does, yeah. And think Lot is talked about a little bit in the Hall of Faith as well. So now it is interesting when Abram talks to God later and he says, hey, if there's 10 righteous in the city, will you not destroy it for 10? Needless to say, he didn't find 10. But he still felt it right to save Lot out of the city. So that does say something to Lot's character and Lot's trust in him. And we're going to get to that in a minute, actually. Verse 6.
And the land is not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together.
Yeah, that's a good problem to have. You've got too much money. Oh, no.
I'll never.
Now, the problem is sometimes when people get too much money, their money runs their life. And so you can see, even in the way that Lot will pick where he goes, he wants to know where is going to feed his cattle the best. Where is going to feed his substance? Where is he going to be the best taken care of in that sense? Which isn't a bad thing to look at, but his substance is running his life. So Lot seems to be aware of the God of Abraham. Abram's been obviously sacrificing unto the Lord, calling upon the name of the Lord. I believe Abram definitely would have told him, hey, I'm going out because God called me, and Lot's like, cool, I'm going with you. So there are a lot of ways where God blesses Lot, and Lot, seems to have some knowledge and understanding of who God is, although his descendants don't seem to keep that, which is a shame. But anyway, verse 7.
And there was a strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle. And the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled then in the land.
So I think it's interesting. The problem doesn't occur or doesn't originate with Lot and Abram. They were getting along swimmingly. They didn't have a problem with each other. I don't know if you guys have ever had somebody live in your house, that wasn't your immediate child and wasn't, from the time they were young. Sometimes they can kind of,
Mess things up.
add some difficulty.
Changes.
It does. For a very short time, my wife and I stayed with her parents while we were waiting on our house to be ready. It was only like a month. It wasn't much. But I felt very uncomfortable for a month. And then when we got the house, we lived there for a couple of years. We decided we'd, put down new floors. And at this point, we were going to get carpet and vinyl plank. And we hired a company out to do it. We were ready to get it done. They looked at our floors and said, that's asbestos tiling. Don't call us. And they were like, oh, great. What do we need to do? They're like, you need to get someone to come out and remove that. And so I called those people. They're like, yeah, it's like $9,000. I'm like, oh, no. So I removed it all myself because that's legal if you do it yourself. And then I put down my own flooring because they still wouldn't come back. But during that time, for a little while we were waiting to figure out what we were going to do with the tile, and we had a claim on our insurance. We were trying to see if the insurance was going to pay to get it all removed, and they decided no, but we'd stayed with a family member at that time for a short while, and that was awful. It was awful for them. It was awful for us. It took a long time to recover from that because it put a real strain on that relationship. And sometimes people can live together and it works out a lot better. It did not in that situation. It did not. But it's okay. It's better now. But it shows a lot of character to me that they had spent all this time together and they still were fine. The problems did not originate with them. But the point is they can't feed all their cattle. They've got a lot. Have you ever thought about how much a single cow eats?
Yes. Approximately 3% of its body weight every day.
So I've never heard that before. So I had to look it up.
That's common for all ruminants.
There we go. So what I found when I looked it up, how much should you feed a cow per day? Now this is dairy cows. I don't know if this is necessarily what they would use. I feel like they used goat milk a lot of times. I don't know. I don't know how they did this. But high-producing dairy cows will eat between 110 to 120 pounds of wet food a day or 50 to 55 pounds of dry food a day. Oh boy. And they have much cattle. Think about, like, that's one cow. I mean, they've got to be eating and eating and eating. It doesn't surprise me they ended up with too much for the land to bear them together. There is a direct quotient on how much land you can fit for one cow. It's kind of like horses. I've looked into horses before. I've been like, you know, it'd be cool to have a horse. How much land do you have a horse? You need like at least an acre or so per thing. And I'm like, this is crazy. I can't. That's too much land.
I don't think you can do that in the city.
I hate
Alex.
mowing, so I'm not worried about it anyway. I'm not getting anywhere that has an acre. But is what it is. But it would have been incredible how much they'd have to eat. Now, there is one more thing to note. Moses makes the note, the Canaanite and the Perizzite were then in the land. Why does he say that?
Because they had herds and flocks too.
That may be a good answer. Who wrote the book of Genesis? Okay. So this would have been written by Moses. Probably, he's already out with Israel. I don't know how much of his writings would have been done in the wilderness, but probably a decent portion of them. These people are hearing about these Canaanites and Perizzites and things like that. And so it may do them some good for historical context to say, hey, these people that we're talking to you about, they were there then too. He's teaching them the history of the world. And some of it they may have known. We've talked a couple times about how long people have lived and how much a lot of this could have been passed down verbally from person to person. But they've also been in captivity for 400 years. And so he's got to re-go over the things that they need to know. And so certain things like that, he's probably noting for their sake to kind of say, hey, this existed then, this exists now. These are things you need to know. And I think it's really interesting the way some of that works out. Just knowing that he has an anachronistic kind of view. He's from the future looking back at the past and saying, oh yeah, by the way, these people were there. And things like that will come up through the book. All right, verse 8.
And Abram said unto Lot, let there be no strife. I pray thee between me and thee, and between my herdsmen and thy herdsmen, for we be brethren.
Yeah. So Abram wants peace with his nephew. He doesn't want it to be a fight. He doesn't even want his workers to fight each other. He's like, hey, what can we do to make this right? And, we'll find he's very generous in how he goes about this. Verse 9.
Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if thou depart to the right, then I will go to the left.
Yeah, so Abram gives Lot the option. This shows a lot of generosity on his part, because it wasn't that Lot who was given this land, it was Abram. And so he's willing to kind of just take the back end of this and say, I'll do whatever you don't want to do, I just don't want to fight. Deuteronomy 2:19, though, is really interesting. Although Lot is not given this land, Lot does end up receiving an inheritance next to Israel. Deuteronomy 2:19. Who's next? Go ahead and read that.
And when thou comest nigh over against the children of Ammon, distress them not, nor meddle with them, for I will not give thee of the land of the children of Ammon any possession, because I have given it unto the children of Lot for a possession.
So you'll find even people who God does not pick to be his special person, sometimes he still made them kings and they have nations or areas that they're given. Think about like the different people who Abraham raised. They become great nations. The Midianites come from Abraham. among other people. And so there are lots of these different people that he has a relation to that God blessed, even though they were not his chosen people. Even Esau gets a portion of land right next to the people of Israel. So, interesting things. I think in 2:9 it also says something about Lot receiving possession, but it's kind of just restated in 9 and 19. All right, verse 10.
And Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the light of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar.
Yep. So Lot picked what looked like the best area. He was like, what's going to feed my flocks the best? What looks like it's the most lush and green and able. It's interesting to me that it's compared to God's garden. This must have been a very nice area at the time. It also is compared to a place in Egypt. So Egypt must have had some pretty nice setups. So, but right. But I just mean that also means that place in Egypt would be comparable to God's garden. Is kind of what I mean. Is there? He kind of equates those three things. So this would have been a wonderful place. It would have looked like a good option for Lot. If you're just looking at the physical side of things, this looks great. Now, again, you have to understand Moses is retelling the history. So he notes notable places. He notes notable stories, things that they would maybe have heard about, like the fact that Sodom and Gomorrah got destroyed. He's letting them know, like, hey, this was before Sodom and Gomorrah got destroyed. So, kind of pull that from your thinking. Sometimes, because we're in the future, we have to look back at the Bible and say, okay, what existed then? Because if we're not careful, we'll put things on people that they wouldn't have known anything about. So like in the time in Deuteronomy, one of the things given for kings is they have to write down the Word of God and read it every day. That would be a really cool thing to still have for kings to do. That said, how many books did they have to write down? What books existed? They didn't have the whole Old Testament. So they would have had, the 5 books of Moses, and they might have had, Joshua and Judges potentially. And so, we're up to 7 books by the time David's there. So you don't have a whole lot that they'd have to be writing down. Now, there is a lot there, don't get me wrong. It's not the 39 books of the Old Testament. And so as you get later, maybe they have to write down more, or they're supposed to. I don't know how long that practice actually kept. Yeah.
And,
So,
those other books are not necessarily book of the law. The book
That's
of
right.
the law is five.
That's
Right.
five.
The chronicles are just the annals of
That's
what's
true.
going on.
And much of that wasn't even, apparently, much of that wasn't even compiled until Ezra's day.
right.
There's a suspicion that Ezra was the guy who compiled what are now referred to as the historical books. Unprovable. It's like who's the author of Hebrews? Unprovable, but it's there as a theory anyway.
There's lots of theories on who wrote Hebrews, too.
That's right.
Anyway, we won't go there. Who's verse 11? Let's hop over to the inside of this next set of tables.
Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other.
All right. Now, Abram was generous. Lot was focusing on himself, so he was being selfish in the moment. This does, however, come back to bite him on multiple occasions. Verse 12.
Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent toward Sodom.
Rough. It should be noted here, he pitches it toward Sodom. He's not in Sodom. He's not in the gates of Sodom. He's in the plains, but it's towards the direction of Sodom. He can see it. Now, there is a progression that you will find for Lot. he starts here, he's toward Sodom. It may be even in the next chapter, he seemingly is moved closer because he gets picked up in a battle that he's not supposed to be a part of. And then by the time Genesis 19 comes, he's in Sodom. He's in the gates of Sodom, which was generally a symbol for judges or leaders. And so there's definitely a progression to be had here with Lot. And it's a slippery slope, and you kind of can see that as the picture of sin. Like, just a little bit here turns into a little bit more and a little bit more until you're like, how did I get here? So it's kind of a nice little double picture there. But
Isn't it interesting how this is the second time in Genesis you see this? Nimrod, they didn't start out gathering together and building a city and a great tower so that God came down. They started out dispersing because that's what they were told after the flood. Disperse, scatter, go out, fill the whole land. And then people start to decide, well, let's get a city. This is a great place to live. This is a rich place, and it's got all these bricks and this wonderful black stuff that we can live together with. Let's do this. Despite what God said, let's do this. You see the same progression beginning in Sodom, where Lot chooses the place that looks easy, chooses the place that looks prosperous and wealthy, and ends up wrecking his life. And there's a caution. I think there's a cautionary tale in this for all of us. When we start pursuing the material things of the world, the material things of the world will rise and bite you.
yeah, well, and the perceived easy way is not normally the best way.
Yes, it's true.
And even the way to salvation, the wide way, is the way that leads to destruction. So,
That's great.
where are we at? Verse 13?
Yes.
All right, Vicky, is that you? Who? Oh, Melinda, I'm sorry.
The men of Sodom were wicked, and the sinners before them Lord exceedingly.
So they already had a testimony of being these evil people. Verse 14.
And the Lord said unto Abram, after that Lot was separated from him, Lift up now thine eyes, and look from the place where thou art northward, and southward, and eastward, and westward.
So God waits till Lot is gone to give him a full expectation of what land is his. He tells him when he's at Shechem, he says, I'm going to give you this land. But now he's saying, hey, anywhere, north, east, south, west, go. And he, I think at some point tells him wherever your foot treads. So at that point, somebody's got to give him Egypt. I don't know about that, but that's kind of a joke. But anyhow, verse 15.
For all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever.
Yeah. So God made an everlasting promise to Abram and his seed after him, which so far is no one, by the way.
That's right.
I got to think when God makes these promises, he's like, okay,
Sure.
that seed, yep, we talked about that a little bit. I mean, he was 75 when it all started. What I know is he's got to be, moving up. It's been a couple years, I'm sure. I know by the time he has Ishmael, he's 86. So I'm like, he's somewhere between 75 and 86. Like, the timeline's moving along. How long are you guys comfortable to wait on something? If someone promised you something and it's taken more than a couple years, are you still thinking it's going to happen?
No.
And there does get to a point where he's like, hey, I still don't have a seed. Maybe we can use my servant. Eleazar, he's a cool guy. Love to have him be my representative. And God's like, haha, no.
I found that to be perplexing. I was researching that this week, in fact, because I thought, well, was there something back in the law that would designate a servant to be an heir? Just like, why would Abram say that? But I didn't find anything.
I don't know that it's something in the law. I think it was just kind of a custom. So you have to understand, servants in that day were to be treated kind of like children. They were taken care of. They had these things. Now, obviously, they worked. It's not like they don't do anything. But they were to be treated like sons and daughters to some degree. Now, if someone did not have children, sometimes they might leave everything to their head servant. But it wasn't something they had to deal with a lot. Barrenness wasn't a very widespread thing, and a lot of these guys seem to have multiple wives. So there seems to be a point where the probability of that happening is not very high. Like I said, the first person noted to be barren is Sarai. Now God, throughout the Bible, uses barrenness or barren women to bring about incredible people and things and to do great things with it. But that's the first time you actually are told about it in the scripture. That doesn't necessarily mean the first time it happened, but it's not common.
Well, you would have to leave it to somebody.
Yeah, right. It's got to go somewhere.
Yeah.
Somebody to be in charge of it, just
Right.
keep it going, keep
Right.
the operation.
You're not wrong.
Well, and the head servant's probably the best one if you don't have anyone else. Frankly, the head servant probably would do better than some of the sons anyway.
Yeah, we see the same thing today. Somebody who's got a large business and wants to see it continue after he's gone,
Yeah.
he can either turn it over to his kids if he thinks they're capable, or he'll turn it over to a management group. Sometimes he'll turn it over to the employees, but they turn it over to somebody who can continue to run it to keep the thing going.
Yeah.
And I think Abram's doing the same thing when he says Eliezer of Damascus.
Right. All right. So let's see. Where did we get to? But it's interesting. Abram at this point still seems to believe God's promise. He's still following where God tells him to go. He's still spending his time in the land of Canaan. The Bible makes a note that he could have returned to his old home. He doesn't say it here. It talks about it elsewhere. But he believed God and he kept going even when it took a long time for this promise to come.
Don't you think he learned a lesson in Egypt, though? Because if he'd have stayed there in the first place.
You know, part of me wonders, because I think God meant for him to go to Egypt, but at the same time, I wonder if he would have just prayed to God and said,
Yeah.
God, can you send the rain now?
Yeah.
Please, can we get rid of this famine? I don't know if God would have let it go. But I've noticed that there are several times in the Bible where, come here, buddy. There are several times in the Bible where people will have something large scale like that physically. Hi. And instead of seeing them pray to God about it, they just get up and leave. And I'm like, I wonder if they would have prayed to God, if God would have given them what they needed. Just a thought. All right, where are we at? 16. You went down.
Thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered.
Yeah. So this phrase is not literal. We have on several occasions seen the children of Israel be numbered. If you're familiar with the book of Numbers, or he'll jump, he'll be fine. If he gets hurt, he'll only do it once. Yep. Everybody smile and wave. All right. Love you, Chris. All right. Yep, they're in their kids' service. All right. But this is not a literal phrase. There are several times they are numbered. Now, recently, people have attempted to number the dust of the earth and different things. There are equations that people use to try to get the amount of things like that are incredible numbers.
There's estimates of the number of atoms in the universe.
Sure there are. And so, but they have a way that they try to make that equation work. Now, I don't know if they're right or if they're even close to right, because I don't know how you double check their math. But here's, like, when I was in school, we asked this question. How many red-haired piano tuners live in New York? What? So, but here's kind of how you figure it out. You get a general understanding of how many people in the world have red hair. 2% maybe. I don't remember what it is. Small amount. How many people have pianos in New York? Well, let's say 200,000. So if you have 3% of the population that's red hair, you've got 200,000 people there. Now how many people know how to tune pianos? And then you kind of work through, and you can do an equation to get a pretty good idea within a certain amount of people that this is the amount of red-haired piano tuners in New York. So I put a list of what this equation would look like. They didn't let me do red-haired piano tuners. It's just piano tuners. But it says this is kind of what that looks like. This is called an order of magnitude. So suppose the population of New York City is 10 million. There's an average of 3 people per household. That means there are 3.3 million households. And 1 in 10 has a piano. We're now down to 330,000 that need tuned year by year. It comes down to 6,000 tunings per week. Suppose that a piano tuner works 5 days a week and he's handling 5 pianos a day. That's 25 pianos a week. If that's the case, you need 240 tuners. And that's kind of how they work through these numbers. And they give a lot of assumptions, but reasonable assumptions. And it gets you close to the right number. Yes, sir.
You said that this isn't a literal statement. Look at it a little bit differently. This is an example of the number of piano tuners needed today in New York when the population is 10 million and all the other assumptions fit. What would it look like in 50 years? Or what would it look like perhaps in 1,000 years, say at the end of the millennium?
Yeah.
Then, how many people would be the seed of Abraham, given that Paul tells us in Galatians that the seed is all those who belong to Christ. That's the promised seed of Abraham. So how does that change whether this is literal or just not fulfilled yet?
I think either way, what you'd run into is he makes statements like as many as the stars in the heaven or the sand on the earth. Even if the world lived another 1,000 years, I don't think we're getting close to the stars of heaven number.
No, I'm talking about getting into the eternal kingdom.
No, I understand that. I'm saying even if you count just believers, all believers of all time, there are billions and billions and billions of galaxies. There are like billions of billions. We would not have had that many people on the earth at that point, unless the earth literally,
Exploded.
yeah, I don't...
The point is not how does it fit within the framework of literal numbers of literal people today. The point is, what does it say about what God may be doing to fulfill his promise to Abraham in the future, in the eternal state beyond the millennial kingdom? Because our real understanding stops at the end of the millennium. When Revelation closes with the millennium and we go into the eternal state, we have no faint clue what God is going to do. So, you may be correct. I'm not disputing that this may not be a literal statement.
Sure.
But it could also be a statement of intent on God's part, which means it gives clues to what the literal might be in the future. That's all I'm saying. Just
Okay.
don't wall yourself off in your thinking. For any of us.
Verse 17.
Arise, walk through the land and the length of it, and then the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee.
So he's told to go through the land to sojourn in the place that he will futurely possess, because he does not currently. And that's the big thing about the patriarchs, is they're given these promises. They don't receive it as of yet, but they believe God that they will. It's kind of the way the Old Testament saints would have, what they would have understood about God. They are given specific information. Are they faithful with what they have? All right, verse 18.
Then Abram removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord.
Now, this was Abram's custom. His devotion and worship to the Lord was serious. If he was going to be somewhere for a while, he built an altar, he'd sacrifice, he'd make sure his focus was on the God that he followed, which is a good thing.
He always did that first thing too, it sounds like.
Yeah.
That's the first thing he did.
Yeah. All right, so that is Genesis 13. We will open up next week, Genesis 14, and I believe that's where you are introduced to the character of Melchizedek.